They work in both the United States and Mexico as that population of jaguars travels between the two countries. They are primarily based in Tucson, Arizona and Sahuaripa, Mexico. And Sahuaripa is actually the town I stayed in and worked out of primarily during the course of my project. They have three main areas that they focus on. The first is conservation, the second is research, and the third is education in the local area. The organization was established around the Northern Jaguar Reserve, which itself was established in 2003 when the NJP first formed and bought 3 or 4 local large ranches and created the reserve as a stronghold for the Northern Jaguar population. And then that is the primary way in which they conduct conservation. And then they also work with human-jaguar coexistence in the area as well, which of course I'll go into deeper throughout the presentation. And then in terms of research, they do research on jaguars and other threatened species in the area that live in and around the reserve. And then in terms of education, they do they conduct multiple forms of community outreach, whether it be in schools, local community centers, and then with the local ranching community as well. And then they also help the local ranching community with sustainable ranching practices. And these include things like pasture rotation, better water management and distribution, livestock exclusions, etc. So kind of moving into their program that primarily deals with human-jaguar conflict and coexistence, Viviendo con Felinos. So in English, this translates directly to living with felines. It is primarily based around reducing this conflict through cash incentives. Locally, these are known as premios or prizes, and they're based on trail camera detection of local feline species on ranchers' properties. So for example, bobcat that a trail camera captures on a rancher's property, that rancher receives or landowner receives 500 pesos. Every mountain lion, 1,000 pesos, every ocelot, 1,500 pesos, and then every jaguar, 5,000 pesos. And kind of just to put this in perspective, the average rancher as of 2019 in the area basically receives 18,220 pesos per year. So just seeing a few of these cats per year on their property, and some properties have a lot of sightings per year, can be a huge boost to their livelihoods and their income every year. So kind of talking a little bit more about Viviendo con Felinos, they have 3 specific project areas / objectives. The first is immediately decrease jaguar mortality. The second is encourage conservation ethic among rural landowners. And the third is gain a better scientific understanding of the jaguar. Other program strategies, besides the trail camera and prizes, include building relationships with local landowners, assistance following predation events. So basically, they will help go out to their member properties and record any predation events, how those occurred, any cattle mortalities, and decide whether they occurred from predation or not. And they will help basically report that to the local government, and then those landowners are subsidized for their losses as well. And that helps continue to build those relationships with the landowners. And then they also promote, as I mentioned before, sustainable management strategies on a lot of these ranches as well. So now taking a closer look, this is a just simple GIS map that I generated using some pre-existing NJP data. As you can see at the top part there, that is in green, and then outlined in the light blue is the Northern Jaguar Reserve itself. And then below that, outlined in red in the hatched section, is the extent of all of the Viviendo con Felinos ranches. As you can see, they kind of act like a buffer zone for the reserve. And any jaguars that now wander on to these properties are less likely to have any conflict, therefore creating kind of an ecological buffer zone for these jaguars that both negates some edge effects as well as is still safe for them from any conflict. And then below, as you can see, is Sahuaripa, the town that I worked primarily out of. If you look at the key there or the scale, it doesn't look like Sahuaripa is very far from the bottom of the reserve, but in fact, the trail of, or the network of roads that connects both the reserve, all of these ranches, and Sahuaripa itself are incredibly rugged, and it actually takes 5 to 6 hours to get from that town to the reserve itself. And then, just to give a better idea of the area and kind of the entire area I worked, it was framed by two major rivers, the Rio Eros and Rio Bavispe, and all ranches and that I surveyed throughout my project were located within these two boundaries. And then the entire area is primarily kind of defined by the Sierra Zeta, which is a range of foothills that comes off the Sierra Occidental proper. And then that brings us into my project overview and development. So just a little overview of the project first. My deliverable was a report that analyzes the current effectiveness of the Viviendo con Felinos program, or attempts to, and then the data was collected for this using a survey approach. And then kind of the why as to why I did this was to understand human-jaguar conflict and coexistence in context. As we know, every social ecological system is different, and then there has been quite a large body of research concerning human-jaguar conflict. The social ecological system that I worked in is unique, and the body of research is much smaller for that particular system. And then also I wanted to understand specific factors that contribute to coexistence and conflict in the area. And that brings me to my goals and objectives. So my goal of the project was to once again understand the effectiveness of the Viviendo con Felinos program in promoting human-jaguar coexistence among rural landowners. And then my first objective, and I'll continue to refer to these and remind you of these as we move through the presentation just for reference, was identify the social ecological variables that influence jaguar presence on local properties based on landowner knowledge. And then my second objective was analyze the differences in values towards jaguars and conservation between landowners that were in the program and landowners outside of the program. And then my third objective was to take the data or the results from these first two objectives and create a set of recommendations for the program going forward. And then a closer look at objective 1 and 2 in particular, referencing the three main areas or project objectives of Viviendo con Felinos again. My objective 1 was connected to their first area of the program, which is gain a better scientific understanding of the jaguar. And in particular, even though they have done a lot of research on this in the area, was do that using landowner knowledge of their own properties through the survey approach. And then for the second area that I wanted to measure the effectiveness of was encouraging a conservation ethic among rural landowners. And that is why I wanted to analyze the differences kind of between values and attitudes of both landowners inside the program and landowners that were not in the program as of yet. And then, of course, the third area was to immediately decrease jaguar mortality, and I had no real viable way to kind of assess that. So that's an area of the program that I wasn't able to assess through this project. So kind of moving on to how I developed my survey, there were three major sections. The first was demographics and general information, and then attitudes and values, and management strategies. And then at the end of the survey, there were two sets of questions as well, and you can see those on the right. They were related to both livestock predation events over the last 2 years and 5 years, as well as jaguars that have been sighted by landowners on their property over the last 2 years and 5 years. And these two sets of questions acted as indicators of coexistence for my first objective, where I was analyzing if socio-ecological variables were corresponded with any of these. And then I first wrote first created my survey in English and later translated into Spanish. And I want to once again give a shout out to the NJP and its staff for that, because even though my Spanish skills are pretty good, they've definitely helped with that, as well as any translation issues throughout the course of the project. And then here are just some examples of those three sections, and I'll move through those pretty quick, but just so you guys can take a look. All right, and then moving on to survey distribution. So all survey distribution happened while I was in country between June 17th and July 31st of 2021, was last summer. All surveys were administered in person and not electronically. And this was primarily due to the lack of just exposure and the ability to use any technology in the area, especially in rural areas like the ranches. Of course, there was no Wi-Fi, no service, no access to computers, anything like that. So they kind of had to be administered in person just to create a fair distribution among everyone. And then the surveys were also sometimes verbally administered as well. And this was also due just to low literacy in the area and with certain respondents. And when they were administered verbally, that was another time that the NJP staff helped me out with any translation issues that might happen. And then I was assisted, like I said, with NJP staff with translation issues. And then both landowners in the program and outside of the program were surveyed. Landowners in the program, I actually traveled out to all these separate ranches too, which took a very long time. And because their addresses were known. And then for landowners that had no relationship with the program, I oftentimes spent time at different institutions in the town of South Rifa, such as the Livestock Insurance Agency and other areas like that. And the first few times that I approached these landowners over the course of that month and a half, they didn't respond well to wanting to be surveyed just because of the stigma around possibly killing jaguars in the area. It is illegal and any bounty is unofficial. But over time, continuing to come day after day after day while I was in town, I slowly built relationships with these landowners. I ended up with a small sample size, just 28. And though it is incredibly small, there were some barriers to me having a larger sample size that I couldn't avoid. The first of these was there's only 17 to 18 properties in the program. And I say 17 to 18 and not a specific number because one of them, their owner just passed away, one of the ranches, and they're not sure if they're going to continue with the program or not as a different owner takes his place. And then also the long travel times to properties definitely was another barrier in terms of getting more data for the project as well. So then I wanted to move into the data analysis. Even though these were all administered on paper, I had to manually upload all the surveys into the program Qualtrics after getting all of my data. And then survey responses were then formatted for objective 1 into sets of social ecological variables. And what this kind of means, you'll understand more as I move through my results. Any short answer responses from questions that allow for short answer responses were categorized into common social ecological variables based on their theme. And that will also become a little more clear as I move through my results. And then independent variables, which are what these social ecological variables from the surveys were tested against the indicators of jaguar coexistence that I mentioned earlier, which were predation events and cited jaguar presence by the landowners. For objective 2, once again, objective 2 was measuring that difference in conservation ethic between both the landowners in the program and outside the program in order to measure the program goal of encourage a conservation ethic among rural landowners. I split the two groups up, landowners that were in the Viviendo Confilinos program and landowners that were outside of it. And just because that's a whole lot of words to continue saying throughout the rest of this presentation, I'm going to refer to landowners in the program as VFL for the rest of it and landowners outside the program as NVFL for the rest of this presentation. And then I compared landowner values based on that second section of the survey, values and attitudes, to understand the difference and how the NJP has influenced landowner values and attitudes towards jaguars in the region. And this analysis was to understand the current effectiveness of the program in improving local conservation ethic. Now I wanted to reference some instances of adaptive management, where there are a few big ones throughout the course of my project here. The first was predation events could not ultimately be utilized as an indicator of coexistence, so I ended up just going with jaguar presence. And the reason for this was landowners could not often identify if predation events had actually been the result of jaguars or other predators in the region. And this was less true of landowners within the program, but landowners outside the program didn't have that same expertise from the NJP staff, helping them understand and record what those different cattle mortalities had been the result of. I still believe this will provide valuable insight into the success of jaguar conservation, however. And then my second instance of adaptive management was that results could not be verified necessarily as statistically significant due to the small sample size. And I didn't just guess this, even though it was pretty obvious, but I did do a 2-sample t-test on a lot of the results and pretty much verified it. And then my third was that some social ecological variables could not be tested against that measure of Jaguar presence. And this was because every social ecological variable was based on, and I'll talk about this more in the results, the presence or absence of that specific variable on a property. And if one of those two groups, either the group where it was present or the group where it was absent, had less than 6 answers, around 20% of the sample, I just discarded it from the analysis because really any trends that could be deduced from it were really in the end just not viable or could be used effectively. And that moves us into the results. I just wanted to start with the demographics of my survey group. VFL, the sample size was 14, and NVFL, the sample size was also 14. I didn't actually plan this. This just happened, which was really cool. And as you can see there, the name of some of the ranches on the left that were in the program, and the name of some of the ranches on the right that were outside of the program. And I just want to give a shout out to them as well for all of their help throughout the project. All respondents were male except for one. And the age range of this entire sample was from 35 years old to about 83 years old, and that mean was about 59.2 years. And then I also asked about property size in the survey. I actually had 4 ranges that were asked about specifically. And I chose these specific ranges because the NJP already had a good idea of the size of a lot of these cattle ranches, especially the ones in their program and properties. As you can see, the largest group was in the 1,000 to 2,500 hectare range, and the smallest at just 1 respondent or 2 respondents, was at 2,500 to 5,000 hectares. And then when I also asked about education level in the survey, and as you can see, as education level increased, there were less respondents reporting at each subsequent level. And at those who responded at having completed some primary school were at 13 respondents, and those having reported at having a graduate degree was just 1 respondent. And then I also wanted to ask about income from ranching, because prior to coming down to Mexico, I was in contact with NJP staff, and they made a point to say that not all of these ranchers get their full income from ranching. Therefore, not all of their livelihoods are completely based in that sector. So that's important as well in kind of understanding that the effects of predation on all their livelihoods might not be the same because of these other side businesses they have. One of them was a dentist in town, for example. But the lowest reporting group for this was at 0 to 25% of their income comes from ranching, with 2 respondents, and the highest group was 13 respondents that reported getting 76% to all of their income from ranching. And then moving on to my objective 1 results. So once again, just as a reminder, objective 1 was identify the social ecological variables that influence Jaguar presence on local properties based on landowner knowledge. And that relates once again to the program objective of gaining better scientific understanding of the Jaguar. So my first group of social ecological variables that I analyzed against Jaguar presence were habitat types. About 5 or 6 habitat types were asked about specifically if they were present or not on a property. Unfortunately, most of these, except for the 2 that you see listed up there, forest and desert, had to be discarded due to lack of responses in either the group where they were absent or group where they were present, because those groups just couldn't be viably measured against each other. When it came to both forest and desert, just to explain a little bit about the graph on the right here, and there'll be a few that look like this as I move through objective 1 results. The first set of bars is over a 5-year time frame, and the second set of bars was over a 2-year time frame. And I did this just because of the small sample size. I asked 2 different time frames just to get a better understanding of any trends that might be occurring with such a small sample size. Anyhow, forest and desert were both negatively correlated with Jaguar presence on both on properties, as you can see. This was much more true of desert, which is in the lighter yellow, which had quite a substantial difference between presence on properties where desert was present. And forest, it was much less so. That said, it seems counterintuitive that forest would be negatively correlated with jaguar presence just because of everything we know about sort of the ecology and habitat preferences of jaguars, being primarily a rainforest animal. That said, jaguar presence in Sonora, based on a lot of past research, corresponds with more subtropical vegetation biomes, even in the Sonoran Desert area, which there are a few, but they are present. And none of the forests, at least observed by me throughout the course of my project, really had any sort of subtropical vegetation to them. It was mostly kind of thorn scrub forest and a lot of scrubby kind of drier area. And then the second set of social ecological variables that was tested against jaguar presence were water sources. 3 of these made the cut and didn't have to be discarded due to lack of responses. And this was permanent rivers and streams, temporary lakes and ponds on properties. And then there was another option for other, where they could write in additional water sources that were prevalent on their property. And springs was what a lot of respondents reported as being on their properties as well. All of these variables, as you can see, once again, at the 5-year and 2-year period. And if you can't see that, permanent rivers and streams are in blue, temporary ponds and lakes are in the reddish orange, and permanent rivers and streams are in yellow and springs are in blue. At both time frames, water sources were positively correlated no matter which of the 3 water sources it was, with higher jaguar presence. And this also corresponds and is backed up by a lot of research as well that has been done, which states that jaguar occupancy in the area is higher near water sources. And the primary reasons for this is just due to the lack of water in an incredibly arid region, as well as prey availability near any water sources there are, and the riparian vegetation that exists near it for the ambush style hunting that jaguars prefer. And then another set of variables that was measured against presence was wildlife species. There were 11 species of wildlife listed. I asked on the survey which of these species that landowners had seen on their properties over the course of the last 2 years, whether it be on cameras that the NJP had placed or in person. And then further research suggested that only 3 had any correlation, or 3 species had any correlation with jaguar occupancy in Sonora. And these were peccary and javelina, deer, which are both prey species and primary prey species of the jaguar in the area, as well as mountain lions, which are their direct competition. All 3, and these were the only species that ended up being correlated with jaguar presence whatsoever. And all 3 were present on almost all of the properties. So I really couldn't derive any data from this particular set of social ecological variables. And then referencing my next set of variables, it was sustainable management strategies that exist on these properties. The 3 that made the cut for this instance were photographs and prizes, which, as you all can recall, is the main strategy employed by the Viviendo Confalito, excuse me, Viviendo Confalino's program, gabion construction. And just for reference, a gabion is kind of a incredibly sort of it's an earthen structure of rocks and pebbles that's basically wrapped in wire and creates a artificial water source for local cattle in the area that can trap rain. And then there was also an other write-in option for this, and that was water management. And many of the respondents reported other water management practices as being present on their properties as well. And by water management practices, I mean any other instances where water is captured or distributed using some anthropogenic strategy. And then photographs and prizes and water management practices were both positively correlated with jaguar presence, as you can see once again in both timeframes from that graph on the right. Gabion construction did not show any significant correlation or trend, which was quite surprising due to the fact that's also a water management strategy. This could be due to the fact that most gabions are created near any infrastructure that exists on the ranches. and therefore really jaguars weren't getting close enough to really be affected by said strategy. When it comes to photographs and prizes and water management strategies, monetary and non-monetary incentives have a demonstrated influence on conservation-minded behavior, which is why these photographs and prizes are likely correspond with higher jaguar presence on a lot of these properties. And then when it comes to water management practices, as we saw from the last group of social ecological variables regarding water, water just has quite the influence on jaguar occupancy in an area. And then the last group for objective 1 that I measured against jaguar presence was motivation for ranching, or motivations for ranching. And this is an example of one of those short answer questions that I asked in my survey. So basically I left this open-ended because there's really been no research regarding this specific set of social ecological variables in the past. I made 3 categories based on responses, and these were for tradition and heritage, ranching for enjoyment, and then ranching because it's the local major economic opportunity. Motivation for ranching because it's the local economic opportunity demonstrated a strong positive correlation with jaguar presence, and actually a fairly strong correlation with jaguar presence. And then ranching for heritage and tradition demonstrated quite the negative correlation. And then ranching for enjoyment didn't really show any notable trend. It was actually positively correlated with the 5-year period and negatively correlated with the 2-year period, and not by a huge difference. And then moving on to my objective 2 results. So just a reminder, my objective 2 was analyze the differences in values towards jaguars and conservation between landowners that were in the program and landowners that were outside the program. And then once again, this corresponded with the program objective B of encouraging a conservation ethic among rural landowners in the area. Most of these questions came from a Likert scale. As you can see, there are multiple statements regarding values related to wildlife and jaguars on the left-hand side there. And any respondents could select any of the responses between strongly disagree and strongly agree based on how much they agreed or disagreed with said statement. Referencing the first 2 statements, I feel a strong emotional bond towards wildlife, and the second was we should strive for a world where there is abundance of fish and wildlife for fishing and hunting. Before I get into these individually, I just want to say the value belief norm theory in conservation is that possessing value for nature is key to developing a conservation ethic or any conservation-minded behaviors. So the first statement here, I feel a strong emotional bond for wildlife related to indirect value for local wildlife. And then the second, we should strive for a world where there is an abundance of fish and wildlife for fishing and hunting, related specifically to direct value for wildlife, and more specifically consumptive value for any wildlife in the area. Results for both suggested actually a higher degree of value for wildlife by NVFL landowners, so landowners outside the program. That said, and you can see that there from down below on both of these tables. If you look at the strongly agree option, 10 respondents in NVFL strongly agreed with each statement, whereas only 7 in VFL strongly agreed with each statement. That said, if we look at just positive responses, and any positive responses were correlated with greater value in these 2 instances, they were about even between the 2 groups. So ultimately, there wasn't a huge difference between any reporting on these 2 statements. And then moving on to the next 2 statements, it is acceptable to kill wildlife if it presents a threat to property or person. And I'll start with this one. Obviously, any responses that were negative, strongly agree, or strongly disagree were related to more positive attitudes towards wildlife and jaguars in particular in this case. Results were once again very similar for this statement. As you can see, there's only a difference of 1 in each category. Both VFL and NVFL demonstrated a higher proportion of disagreement in terms of willingness to kill wildlife, however, which is a good thing for the region itself, but it doesn't really show that the program itself has had a ton of effect on that. Both groups, again, demonstrated substantial direct and indirect value for wildlife based on the second statement. Wildlife's main purpose is to benefit humans. And once again, there wasn't a huge difference between the 2 groups in this either. And then the last two statements, and I'm gonna talk about these in a little bit more depth. I like having wildlife on my property. And the last one was, I like having jaguars on my property. So starting with, I like having wildlife in my property. Results were similar for tolerance of general wildlife on properties in both groups. As you can see, 11 in both groups strongly disagreed with the statement. 3 in Viviendo Conflinos agreed, and 2 agreed in the non-Viviendo Conflinos landowner group. 1 individual in NVFL, however, negatively responded with the presence of wildlife, so there was a tiny bit of difference for this statement. And then the most notable difference between any of these statements was the last one. And really the most relevant, I like having jaguars on my property. So all 14 respondents in the program strongly agreed and had a positive response to this statement in particular, whereas there were 5 negative responses and 1 neutral response for NVFL. And when I say neutral response, what was written in the survey was neither disagree nor agree with the statement. As you can see, 4 strongly disagreed, 1 disagreed, and 1 had that neutral response. So in terms of actual tolerance of jaguars on properties, the program has had some effect on attitudes and values. And then I also just kind of wanted to touch on reasoning for these opinions on jaguars. So there was 1 question further in the attitudes and values section beyond the Likert scale questions. And it basically asked, what was your reasoning for the final statement? I like having jaguars on my property. Why did you respond the way you did? Whether you disagreed, whether you agreed, or whether you had a neutral opinion. So some examples of positive responses were because they're beautiful, because they're necessary for controlling the ecosystem, and jaguars are a way to earn extra money, referencing the Premios program. We have to take care of the species, and they are beautiful. So some responses were actually pretty dynamic and had multiple lines of reasoning as well. Examples of negative responses, because they eat my cattle, and those are my living, which is understandable, and because they have eaten cows, bulls, and horses. And all of those were very similar, all based on livestock predation events. And then every example of a neutral response was basically, for me, it doesn't happen. So any neutral responses ultimately were based on the fact that just that particular landowner hadn't really run into any predation events recently. And then, as you can see, the neutral responses versus the positive responses and the negative responses actually paints a slightly different picture from the original statement on the Likert scale. In the Viviendo Conflinos landowners group, there were 11 positive responses and 3 neutral responses instead of 14 positive responses. So ultimately, I couldn't end up stating that, oh, all of these responses were purely positive. Just in some cases, properties in the program hadn't run into any predation events directly and therefore had no strong opinion on the matter. And then this moves into my third and final objective and last part of my presentation, last section of my presentation, which are my major recommendations for the NJP in conducting the Viviendo Conflinos program going forward. I just want to point this out. They had a lot of really cool murals that they painted in town. And it was a really small town with not a lot of like magnificent infrastructure in any way, shape, or form. These really livened up the town, and really their work throughout the town has made quite the positive difference in like how the town perceives jaguars, because they've kind of been put on the map for the conservation that NJP has done there regarding jaguars, and there's a lot more pride than there used to be surrounding the species in the area. So my first recommendation to the program is it may be difficult to continue to, or is increase program membership. And this is primarily because of it may be like it was for my project, hard to continue to evaluate the further success of the program as it goes on with such a low membership. There is a possibility to kind of measure the effectiveness of the program over a time scale to achieve more data points. But when comparing it to other ranches in the region, there's just not a lot of basis for comparison due to the small sample size that you'll run into. And then considering that landowners outside the program have negative attitudes towards Jaguars, it's also imperative just to increase this membership in the area by the fact that, as you saw, the ranches in the program did create somewhat of a buffer zone around the reserve. That buffer zone was far from complete and only really covered the south side of the reserve. And there are many more ranches that surround the reserve on all sides, and continuing to create that buffer zone will continue to help the local Jaguar population. My second recommendation based on my results was focus on education. So once again, I'm referring to landowners outside of the program's negative attitudes around Jaguars. Not only was this based around predation, based on a lot of their responses as to why they didn't like Jaguars on their property, but also a perceived fear of the animal itself. So continuing to work on education, not just with the ranches that are a part of the program, but education in the community as well, will help decrease that fear and teach a little bit more about the species that are sort of persecuted in the area, like the jaguar. And then my third recommendation was to focus on conservation of riparian areas on local properties. So this was specifically because, as you can see, a major theme of this entire project was that jaguar presence is positively associated with water sources. And a lot of this is because, and on properties in particular, because these ranchers create a lot of artificial water sources and catchment structures throughout their properties. It attracts a lot of jaguars to them, and a lot of these artificial water sources are closer to infrastructure on the ranch and where the cattle are kept. So preserving riparian areas, which are few and far between in the local region, but do exist on a lot of these properties. A lot of these riparian areas are further away from the main infrastructure areas of the ranch. And as we saw based on past research in the area, jaguar presence is positively correlated with riparian areas in particular, just due to the presence of prey and availability of hunting grounds there. So continuing to focus on these and the conservation of them should be another priority of the program as well. And they already do some work with these. I just want to reference, and this includes creating livestock exclusions around riparian areas just due to the sensitivity of those habitats. And then moving on to my fourth recommendation for the program, the promoting water management practices, once again, referencing that major theme of water throughout my project, is another priority for the NJP. Once again, referencing the importance of water for jaguars in the local social ecological system, improved water distribution and retention practices on properties will help, obviously, not just with the cattle themselves and their own livelihoods, but will also help promote jaguar occupancy on these different ranches. And then my fourth is integrate tradition with conservation. And this was primarily because, as we saw in Objective 1, the motivation for ranching of being tradition-based was actually very strongly positively correlated or negatively correlated with jaguar presence. Therefore, those individuals that were ranching for tradition as their main motivation showed quite a negative correlation with jaguar presence and thus coexistence on their properties. There's not been a lot of research in particular done between the connection between motivations for ranching as a livelihood and the and coexistence of jaguars on properties. So I can't really speak to how research necessarily backs this up, but this is based purely on my own results. And I think it's something that the NJP could benefit from looking further into in the future, is kind of integrating those two things together in a cohesive way. And then that brings me to kind of the end of my presentation here. I just wanted to mention some points of reflection from my project. The first area of reflection that I would like to point out is the importance of adaptive management throughout my project. As you see, I had quite a lot of areas where I had to kind of change the course of my project throughout it. And as we saw earlier, both my methodology and the synthesis of my results, this was true. So it became a theme throughout the course of my project, especially with such a small sample size. Allowing time and space for these instances was crucial in its success. And it's something that I definitely want to make room for in any future project that I conduct. And then another point of reflection was the importance of building relationships with stakeholders. Like I said, I had an automatic in kind of with a lot of the VFL landowners in the program, just because they worked with the NJP before. There'd been a few other guest researchers that they'd met before. Luckily, I spoke a good amount of Spanish at that point, so there was a little more trust there in that way. That said, when it came to landowners outside of the program, just because of the fact that killing jaguars is illegal, but it's somewhat of a way to protect livelihoods and somewhat related to tradition in the area, just due to the unofficial bounties that have been around for quite some time since the mid-20th century. It was just important that I showed my face day after day at a lot of these areas, such as at that livestock insurance agency, and really built relationships with some of these ranchers and landowners. And I say this just because the first few times I asked, I got a hard no. And then as I came back, you know, just talking about some of the things that, you know, make us all similar no matter where we're from and whatever else. I started to build relationships, and then they'd be like, okay, yeah, I'm ready to answer this because, you know, I have more trust. And then the other was just working independently. And I cite this because it is not something I will do in the future. It was very hard to complete this project, the actual written portion of it and creation of my deliverable completely on my own. Obviously, I had help in other areas in terms of the on-the-ground research and methodology and everything. But just having another pair of eyes with the same goal as me is something that I really would like to have in the future if I do something like this again. And I kind of just referencing my time in CLTL and our team projects, as Mary and Emily know, it's definitely good to have, you know, more people out there helping you, you know, with your own ideas and kind of bringing in those extra opinions as you move through projects like this. And then the last one kind of moves us into the last one, the advantages of teamwork. Really, I couldn't have done this without my project partners in the region. My primary contact, who was the only person who spoke any English, left halfway through because he had something to take care of. So I was with a completely Spanish-speaking population, and I will say that my Spanish skills are up there, but I'm not fluent by any means, especially when it comes to localized slang and accents. And just, you know, these different members of the organization taking the time to work with me, taking time out of their, you know, daily whatever else they have to do, bringing me on trips into the field with them to go talk to these ranchers. I couldn't have finished this project without them, and it just speaks to the importance of teamwork. And that's my presentation.